There was kind of an explosion once all the lockdowns ended of people that were it was called revenge travel. They were getting in the trips that they weren't able to take. And by all accounts, everything is back to where it was in terms of its previous levels.
Welcome to Not in a Huff with Jackson Huff, where we interview newsmakers, storytellers, and all-around interesting people. Sit back, relax, unless you're driving, and enjoy the show. Here's Jackson.
Hello. I am Jackson Huff. This is Not in a Huff. Thanks so much for joining me. As always, really appreciate it. This week, speaking with Gary Arndt. Now, if you're a longtime listener and think, that name sounds familiar, well, it is. I interviewed Gary in October of 2020. The release date was October 14th of 2020 to be exact, so almost 4.5 years ago. So this was fun for me in several regards. One, just to kind of catch up with Gary. He's a really great guy, and I'll talk about in a minute just what he's got going on. But it was fun for me, too, because I was able to listen to that last episode and make sure I wasn't asking the same questions again. And this podcast started in September of 2020, so I got to kind of hear a very early episode. It was the 6th episode of this podcast. This is going to be episode 250-something, I believe. I've almost lost track. It's so long ago, so at least 250 episodes ago. So it's fun to see just how much the podcast has changed. You know, I was actually pleasantly surprised with the questions I asked back then. It wasn't half bad. The sound wasn't great, but I did an all right job. But when I talked to him before, we talked about travel. He is somebody who's traveled to over 100 countries. He's a photographer, award-winning photographer. We talked about that. We talked about his podcast briefly. That was 4 years ago. We also, back then, it was in the height of the COVID pandemic, so we were talking about travel restrictions and whether travel would ever go back to normal and all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of fun to listen to that one, too, just a snapshot of what was happening back then. Lots changed since then. Obviously, travel has completely opened back up, and I like to think that we're on the other side of the pandemic. But this time, we're going to briefly hash what we talked about before and get an update from him. But we're mostly going to talk about his podcast, Everything Everywhere Daily. He had just started that podcast back when we last spoke. I think he said like 4 months into it at that point. Well, that means he's almost 5 years into it now, and his podcast is doing very well. It is a daily podcast. It's one that's about 10 minutes long, and every day he teaches a different subject. He teaches, 1 week it may be about a certain revolution. 1 week may be about how Coca-Cola was created. I don't even know if he's got those two, but just to kind of tell you different things. Every day, I just said, and I'm going to leave that in. I just said 1 week might be this, 1 week might be that, just because it's so unique that he does this daily. So every day you can listen to a nice little 10-minute snapshot of learning something. If you would have started listening to that back when we first chatted, I think you'd be a pretty smart person when it comes to going to the local trivia at this point, because you would have learned a little bit about a lot of things. So this is a really fun chat. Really great to catch up with Gary. Here is Gary Arndt. Mr. Arndt, how are you?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
I'm good. Yeah, I was just saying it to you off air, but we've talked before. We talked 4 years ago. I've had I guess you have the distinct pleasure of being the second person that I ever talked to again. The last time it was just a year apart, but this is 4 years apart. So I definitely don't want to just do a rehash of what we talked about before, but I want kind of a little bit of a snapshot of who you are. That way, if people hadn't checked out that episode from 4 years ago, I don't know why they haven't, but if they haven't, they kind of know who Gary is.
Let's see. I started an internet company in the 90s, sold it before the dot-com bubble burst, went back to school for a bit, hatched the plan to travel around the world for a year, sold my home in 2007, ended up traveling the world for 13 years. That ended during the pandemic, and I pivoted and launched a podcast, and that's probably the biggest thing that's happened since I last talked to you, because the podcast has exploded since then.
Yeah, and I listened to that episode here 2 days ago just to kind of check, and it was a nice little walk down memory lane. The thing that I realized is it was a pretty good interview. I'm so glad that I have an editor now because there's some crazy parts outside of that. But I want to, I guess I want to stop at, last time we talked a lot about travel and we talked a lot about COVID because, most times I feel like a nice little 4 year span is not a huge difference in people's life, but where we were in 2020 and where we are in 2024, definitely when it comes to the travel world is quite different. So have you traveled much since 2020? I know back then nobody was traveling.
No, I have not traveled at all. I mean, other than like going to a conference once or twice a year, you'll note my voice is kind of hoarse. And that's because I went to Podfest in Orlando the weekend before. And now every time I fly or go through an airport, I get sick. And this is kind of the result of it.
Oh well, that's no fun at all. I guess let's talk about maybe you haven't traveled, but we were talking a lot about just how travel was going to change and how we thought travel was going to change from then on. And you mentioned in our last conversation about how you thought that, hey, I think that business travel is going to change, that I think that people are going to do Zooms and web conferences more. And man, was that ever correct? I feel like Zoom is a part of everyone's life now. So you were a little bit, I guess, kind of a future reader at that point. But how do you think outside of the business world? How do you think travel has changed since 2020?
In a lot of ways, it's gone back to normal. Uh, there was kind of an explosion once all the lockdowns ended of people that were it was called revenge travel. They were getting in the trips that they weren't able to take. Um, and by all accounts, everything is back to where it was in terms of its previous levels. Um, and probably a little bit higher beyond that. If you're an American, things are great right now because the US dollar is so strong compared to foreign currencies. We're almost at parity with the euro, which it's been ages since that happened. Um, and we're at or near all-time highs against almost every other currency on earth. So it's a really good time to travel. Just to put it into perspective, in 2008, I was in Australia, and I think it was almost at parity with the US dollar, one Australian dollar for one US dollar. And now it's like one Australian dollar you can get for, I think, like 68 cents. So I kind of want to go back and get revenge on Australia for having spent so much money when I was there last time and kind of do it on the cheap. And a lot of these places like Australia are otherwise rather expensive places to visit. So it's kind of a good deal if, like I said, if you're using US dollars.
Yeah, for sure. And I've felt that myself because I've done plenty of revenge travel since 2020. I think I've went to nothing like you in your heyday, but I think I've been to about 10 countries since we last talked. And I remember back in like 2017 when I first started traveling to Europe, just like you're talking about. I think it was, and I could be wrong, but I feel like it was almost like $1.20, $1.25, $1.30 for €1. And when I was just there, I think it was like $1.07 for every euro. So definitely a lot easier to make your money go a little bit further. So yeah, I think it's a good time for us to travel. And maybe I've got some friends that travel to us from Germany, and it's not a great time for them. They're not used to it, so it's kind of finally getting even, like you said. So I want to, I guess, let's start talking about the podcast. When we talked before, you had been doing the podcast for 4 months. It's been a little bit longer now. So let's talk first. Introduce the podcast, what it is. It's called Everything Everywhere Daily. I was shocked and amazed at the time, 4 months in, that you were doing it every day and we're coming up with something every day. Again, 4 years later, you're still doing it, I think, pretty much every day and coming up with something every day. So I guess I'm in complete awe of that. But talk about Everything Everywhere Daily.
As you mentioned, it's a daily educational show. Episodes are about 12 to 15 minutes long, and every day is something different. You'll learn something new every day. One of my listeners said you have everything from Crassus to molasses. So Roman history to the episode I'm working on tonight that I'll be working on after I'm done talking to you are the history of soft drinks. The one I did yesterday was the Iran hostage crisis from 1979, 1980. So it really runs the gamut. And my next episode is going to be episode number 1668.
I can't even imagine it. This would probably be like episode 235, and I feel like I constantly busy. So you got a lot on your plate. How do you, I guess, how do you come up with all these ideas? Back then you said you had a list of 100 ideas, and you were just trying to decide whether they're long enough for that 7-minute episode. But again, you just talked to over 1,000 episodes. How do these just keep coming to you?
I use the exact same Google Doc that I mentioned when I talked to you 4.5 years ago now, and I've just added to it. So now I'm up to like 950 show ideas plus the 1,000 some that I've already done, and it's just a constant process.
Yeah. So what does the research look like for it? Because it is a short show, but you still have to do. I mean, it seems like you have to do quite a bit of research in order to create a concise thing. Because what I've kind of learned in podcasting myself and listening to others is it's almost harder sometimes. Not everything, but it's almost harder sometimes to make things concise and make sense rather than just blow off for 15 minutes and eventually cover everything you need to cover. So how do you make sure you get everything you need in that concise format that you're so good at?
At this point, I got it down to a science. I've done so many. I've estimated I'm closing in on having. So I write a script for every episode. The scripts average 2,000 words, and I'm closing in on having written 3 million words for all of my scripts. And like I said, I got it down to a science. I can do it now in like 4 to 6 hours. And I usually have to have a fairly good idea of at least generally what I'm going to be saying before I start. So, like I said, after this, I'm going to be working on the history of soft drinks. And I've done the history of cheese, history of coffee, history of wine, history of all this stuff. And I already kind of have a good idea of the way things are going to go in my head. And it starts out going back to ancient times where the Romans and the Egyptians and other cultures, they basically put flavoring in water. This kind of became a bit more advanced during the Islamic Caliphate because they couldn't drink alcohol, where they created syrups to create flavored drinks. And then things really took off in the 18th century with the development of carbonated water. And then from there, it's Dr. Pepper, Coca-Cola, and all the modern stuff that we know of today.
Yeah. So you just kind of went through an episode there, but is all this in your head? What's the research look like?
The research, it's a process. Like I said, if I put it on the list, then I at least have a very rough idea of what the topic is about. And then from there, once it gets closer to actually doing it, it's a matter of figuring out some of the specifics of how I want the story to go, and then doing research, getting some more data, years, names of particular individuals that are important, things like that. But like I said, I usually have a good idea beforehand, and I get ideas from everywhere. The biggest source of new ideas is other episodes. A good example, a couple days ago, I did one on crazy plots that were hatched by the CIA, including one where they did surgery on a cat to put a radio receiver in its ear. They put a wire down its tail to act as an antenna, and the cat got killed like immediately by a car when they let it go. It was supposed to be a spy cat. But there were so many crazy ideas with regards to just Fidel Castro that I'm just going to do a full episode on the CIA trying to kill Fidel Castro.
Well, I just wonder, again, kind of pairing our podcast up against each other when it comes to just, I started mine around the same time as you did. And I don't want to say got burnt out, but I definitely got burnt out of editing it. So I'm so glad that I don't have to do that part anymore. You talked about how you do it every day and that it spends 4 to 6 hours doing it. So what's the hardest part of keeping, I guess, the daily grind going, literally the daily grind going with this podcast?
It's a job. This is my job. And, at this point, it's a full-time job. It's easily paying for all my expenses, and it's doing quite well. And I just treat it as such. If people go into work for 8 hours a day, we don't say, oh my gosh, how do you do it? because it's the top priority in my life, I just treat it like a job. And, of all the jobs you can have, it's not a bad one.
I don't feel like it would be at all. I guess what's your listener base look like? Given again, it's a daily thing. Do you find that you have people that, when they're brushing their teeth, they've got to listen to everything everywhere daily, and most of your listeners are daily listeners? Do people kind of drop in when topics make sense to them, or what's that look like, you think?
It's all across the board. So to give you an idea, I went and checked my numbers. I last talked to you in October of 2020. In October of 2020, my show got 25,800 downloads. Now I get that before noon every day. And I'm doing about 1.5 million downloads a month. So the show has just, exploded. And I get people that listen with parents with their kids. They'll listen at breakfast. I've had people tell me they listen when they drop their kids off at school. I got truck drivers. I got mail delivery people. I got professors, people from every walk of life, anybody who's curious. If you look on my Spotify demographics by age, it's like flat through every age group. It's kind of the same, which is kind of remarkable. So it's young, old, people of working age. It's really kind of hard to pin down what the demographics of the show are like.
What about as far as is most of your listeners in the US? I think back when we were talking very, very close to that, I had talked to somebody who was pretty famous in the Philippines. So ever since then, I've got a large following in the Philippines that I never expected. Do you have an area that you didn't expect that, you're really popular in, Oman or something?
I briefly had a lot of people in Iran that listened. I have a sizable audience in the Philippines. There's this one guy who says he has a restaurant and he just lets the show play all day long.
Oh, that's awesome.
In the restaurant, and the people kind of like it because it's very different than just playing music. But I would say about 75% of the audience is American, followed by Canada, UK, Australia, and other major English-speaking countries, of which I would consider the Philippines one.
Yeah, no, for sure. And you've already kind of touched on a few topics that you've covered recently, but I want you. I mean, it's almost impossible. Again, you've talked about 1,000. You've got over 1,000 episodes, but what's some of your favorite things that you've covered? And I know that's a hard question.
I do a lot of stuff on Roman history. I do episodes on mathematics, which are becoming harder to do because explaining math on a podcast without visual aids is very difficult. I'll do some science and technology again when I can explain the concept. So I did an episode in the last month on the origins of quantum mechanics, kind of explaining how it got developed and what was the purpose of it. And it was all to solve a problem that nobody could solve. And so this one guy came up with a solution. It's like, well, if we break everything up into tiny little units, this works. But of course, that's not reality. But it turns out that was reality. I always try to kind of just mix it up so I don't do the same thing 2 days in a row. That way, if you don't like something one day, you'll like it the next day.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense for sure. And you're the seasoned pro, so I feel like I need to be taking notes as I'm asking this question. But what do you say to people who do want to start a podcast or they want to grow their audience, that kind of thing? What do you say to other podcasters?
Well, if you want to grow your audience, you got to get your name out there, which means doing things like I'm doing, like appearing as a guest on other podcasts. I advertise on other podcasts. I do ad swaps. I buy ads on shows. I buy them on podcast apps. So I'm willing to spend money for marketing. And what I found is that really pays off. Another big advantage I have is because it's a daily show, I am creating more episodes, which means more opportunities for discovery. And I think a lot of podcasters would be better off, even if they have a weekly show, to do a second show every week. It doesn't have to be an interview. It could just be a solo show. And a lot of people I know that have done that had interview shows, and they started to do a solo show once a week, find that the solo show gets more downloads than the interviews. Because the interviews are more often than not going to be dependent upon who is being interviewed. And, there's a lot of interview podcasts that I listen to, and if the person they're interviewing is not something I'm interested in, I'll usually skip it because there also tend to be a much larger commitment. If an episode of Joe Rogan can go 3 hours.
No, that's 100% true. I think that's exactly what this podcast. I feel like it. That's why I asked you that question too. It does matter very much of who I'm interviewing, and they're following just as much as my own. So I think that's a huge thing. I really appreciate I guess your candidness with that. And when we're talking about candid, I want to talk about um when we talked last time, you talked about photography, and that's the one thing that I'm most embarrassed about our last interview. I feel like I was you talked about all these really cool things that you had taken pictures of, and I just at that point I was not prepared to I guess go off script, and I kind of just almost interrupted you and didn't let you really talk much about photography because I didn't really have questions prepared. So I want you to tell us a little bit more about your photography, and are you still collecting National Geographics?
I can answer the second question first.
Yeah, you very much are.
Um, so this was the year that I actually unpacked a lot of the stuff that I originally put away back in 2007 when I started to travel. And one of those things were all my National Geographics. They're extremely heavy, they're bulky, and I had no place to put them before. So I got a new place now. I got room for them, so I was able to finally do that. As for photography, that's the one thing, because I'm not traveling as much anymore, and I'm doing more. I'm focusing on the podcast. I've really not done any photography at all since the pandemic started. But I still have all my gear, and it's something that there are a lot of people that still know me more for photography than even for podcasting.
Yeah. Do you feel like, now that you've got this show and something that, people expect to hear every day, that if you wanted to, you still could travel, or is that one of the things you've given up because of the show, that it would make it a lot more difficult?
I could, but it wouldn't be traveling like I did before. I wouldn't be running around constantly. I could go somewhere and just do the show in that place. In fact, I was thinking of going to Australia this winter, but I just haven't done it. But I could pretty much do that at any time. As long as I have an internet connection, I'm fine. I think that I may have to buy like I probably wouldn't take this microphone with me because it's way too big. But there are smaller versions of this that I could easily pack. I have most of what I would need for like a remote kit for traveling already taken care of. So it's really just a matter of doing it. So like I said, this last year, it's kind of been, the show's been doing really well, and I've been kind of tying up loose ends. And this next year, I'm really going to be focusing on the growth of the show. And I think that the opportunity is finally there for me to maybe go somewhere again and to record the show remotely. Where that'll be, I don't know yet.
Yeah, well, we'll have to stay tuned to find out. I do want to go back very briefly to the National Geographic, just because something that I wondered about it's like 4 or 5 years ago, because I guess I collect ephemera. I collect all that kind of stuff, and I had came across some National Geographics. I thought, oh man, this is really cool. This is from like 1902. These were maybe really cool. But what I've found from National Geographics is there's key issues, and then you got like the first 10 that are worth something, and then in the middle, early 1900s are just cool. That's basically all I can say, is they're cool. They're not worth very much of anything.
Generally speaking, the older they are, the fewer they're going to be, and the more money they're worth. The very first, I have a copy of issue 1, number 1, the very first issue ever made. I think it's buried under something right now. But that goes for a lot right now, if you ever see it come for sale on like eBay. But then it drops dramatically kind of after that. So if you wanted to get something from 1902, I think you're probably running somewhere in the neighborhood of $10 to $40 an issue, depending on the condition.
That's better than I thought. Then I've got a couple $100 worth of it in the closet back there. That's not too bad then.
And like a lot of my collection I got for free. So like 20 years ago, I put a classified ad in the newspaper just saying, I collect National Geographics. I will take them off your hands. And a lot of people have them from their parents or whatever. They feel bad about throwing them away. And so I got a lot. And That's how I got the bulk of my collection. There are a couple of other things that I had to kind of scour on eBay, but for the most part, that's where. The other thing is that I don't have anything since I started traveling because I stopped subscribing in 2007. So I now have this gap of recency for like the last 15 years.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's the thing with National Geographic too, where I talked to a guy that was a big ephemera dealer, and the kind of the thing that he said was everyone in the world's grandma has a you know newspaper from when JFK was shot, and they think, oh my gosh, that's probably worth money. But the thing is, millions of people save that exact same newspaper, and I feel like that's almost what you have a problem with National Geographic, that almost everyone kept their National Geographics and they don't want to get rid of them. They feel bad about throwing them away, and there's more of those out there than a lot of other publications. I don't know if you feel the same or not.
That's true, and there's not a lot of people that collect them. So this isn't like collecting baseball cards or comic books where there's like a whole industry set up around it.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, very few people collect magazines at all.
Yeah.
I think collecting like Life magazine or something like that would actually be kind of an interesting thing to collect because they have so many iconic covers, especially if you go back to like the mid 20th century. But yeah, I enjoy National Geographic and its history, and I think one of these days I'll probably even do a podcast on it.
That was going to be my next question. Have you done any podcasting on National Geographic? But sounds like, is it already on your list?
It is on the big list, and the day I pull the trigger on it, it's going to be one of the easiest episodes for me to do because I could probably just do most of it from memory.
I have no doubt about that. Do you feel like, I guess, how do you, let's go back to the podcast. Enough National Geographic. I took us down a rabbit hole, but how do you again, because you're so good at making them very informative but also really concise. So how do you decide, it's these topics that are really big? Obviously, you just covered the Iran hostage crisis. There's whole 3-4 hour documentaries about that. So how do you decide this is the most important parts for people to hear quickly? And then also, do you have like nothing can go over this amount of time? I used to do that, but it's kind of went away on my end.
Yeah, because it's a daily show, I definitely want to put parameters on how long it's going to go. And the longer it goes, that's more work for me.
Mm-hmm.
But so for an episode like that, I think one of the biggest things is the actual hostage taking itself is one of the least interesting things about it. The interesting thing is, why did this happen? And then what were the ramifications after it happened? I mean, you can explain what happened. They were taken prisoner. They were treated poorly. They were subject to torture and other things. That part is very brief. And it's like explaining a lot of historical battles. Explaining why the battle happened is, for the most part, more important than explaining the actual details of what happened in the battle. Like, their left flank moved over here. And there's only a couple battles in history where what happened in the battle like really matters, like the Battle of Cannae during the with Hannibal against Rome. That was in the Second Punic War. That was a unique battle in terms of his strategy, but for the most part, that's really not something you talk about. It's really about what was the cause of it, how was it resolved, and then what was the legacy of it. And you can do that for many, many different topics.
Yeah, and how do you a lot of times you cover in the facts, so you'd think that would be easy, but in the last 4 years, I do think that polarization's only gotten more so. So how do you make sure that you're keeping things factually and not making anybody upset, or do you just not worry about it and you just do what you need to do?
I never talk about current events. I never insert politics into anything. And to the point where people have mentioned that they really appreciate it. And I've often said, people have said, oh, you should do a thing on this topic that's in the news right now. I'm like, there are so many different news outlets that will talk about this. You do not need me. I'm not adding anything to the conversation by talking about it. I'm going to keep focusing on what I'm doing. And if you want politics and current events, there are thousands of outlets that you can turn to get that information.
Yeah. No, I think that's an important thing for sure. I think people are desperately seeking that out. I try my best to offer that same thing. I rarely go into anything of very much controversy, so I like that for sure. I don't want to keep you too much longer. You've got another podcast to record, so again, tell people how they're going to find not just the podcast. You've got some other things going on. Um, talk about all things Gary Arndt, and then all things everything everywhere daily.
All things me at this point in my life is pretty much the podcast. That's kind of taken up everything. There are a couple other things I'm doing. I have a smaller podcast that I help out with. It's not really my podcast. There's a local microbrewery in town, and I know the owners, and I've helped them launch a podcast, and I'm kind of the host of it, but they're the experts. The owner, well, I should say the owners, are a former astrophysicist from NASA, and his wife is a professor of chemistry. So we talk about the science, the history, the culture, and the economics of beer and brewing, which is kind of a very different perspective. Other than that's kind of it. And I had a very large DVD collection before I started traveling, and I've unpacked that, and I've started the process of replacing everything with Blu-rays because they didn't exist to kind of date when I started traveling. So I'm in the process of that and expanding my collection. I quite honestly have a pretty great movie collection. It's almost up to 1,000 different films with no garbage. So I don't have a single MCU title yet, I don't think.
Oh, there you go. That's good. So everything everywhere daily is kind of where we're finding Gary out these days, and I assume darn near anywhere that podcasts can be found, they're going to find the podcast, right?
Yeah, wherever you're listening to this right now, you can just search for Everything Everywhere and you will find it.
I got you. I really, really appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
So that was Gary Arndt. Really appreciated his time. Great to catch up with him again. I'll walk kind of down memory lane to allow me to listen to that first episode again. I really, really appreciate his time. Learned a lot more about his podcast. Urge you to check that out. Like I mentioned, like he mentioned, an everyday podcast, and you're going to learn a ton about a lot of different things. It's a nice little 10-minute snapshot. You can listen to it while you're brushing your teeth, listen to it while you're driving out of your neighborhood. It's quick enough, just little digestible pieces of information. I know he'd appreciate you listening in, so I urge you to do that. I'm just wondering what he's going to have going on in 4 years when we talk again. I mean, he's done so much in these last 4 years. He's just going to, I don't know, have taken over the world in the next 4 years. I'm not sure, but appreciate you, Gary. Go check out his podcast. A link to all that will be in the show notes. Everything Everywhere Daily. If this is your first time listening to this podcast, or you haven't already, go follow along on Instagram, on Facebook, Not Enough Podcast, on TikTok. Of course, go subscribe or follow along on Apple or Spotify. Leave that 5-star rating. Helps a ton. Leave a written review. Helps even more. But I appreciate you being here. Take it away, Chris.
This has been Not in a Huff with Jackson Huff. Thank you for listening. Be sure to join us next time, where we will interview another amazing guest who is sure to make you laugh or make you think. Or, hey, maybe even both. But until then, keep being awesome.